Yangon has more colonial-era structures than any city in Southeast Asia. But as Myanmar opens its doors to the world, many of these grand old buildings are in danger of being consigned to history. This is what's left of Yangon's famous Pegu Club. In the late 19th century, it was the most prestigious meeting place for Burma's colonial rulers, who would swap stories with army officers and visiting dignitaries over many a gin and tonic. Buildings like this one have withstood natural disasters and war, but can they survive the modernization of Yangon? I'm Anasuya Sanyal, and this is the New Myanmar. Yangon, I'm discovering, is steeped in history. The shadow of Shwedagon Pagoda has loomed over the city for more than 1,000 years. Guarded by powerful spirits, or nats, who according to Burmese mythology are said to live in the wind and air, and who must be appeased lest they unleash their fury upon the mortal population. At dusk, the Sule Pagoda, which once dominated the skyline, casts a golden glow across the bustling downtown streets. But its glow is growing dimmer, and its dominance is in decline as it competes with mushrooming office blocks, high-rise hotels, and luxury condos. This is Yangon's future, and this is its recent past. Crumbling colonial-era buildings, many of them abandoned. During Myanmar's decades of isolation, nobody paid much attention to them. But now that the country is opening up, developers are making up for lost time.
The other cities that I've been to in the region, I think the speed of their development was so quick that a lot of buildings came down before there were any rules put in place to preserve them.
The speed of Myanmar's modernization is taking many people by surprise, including the conservation movement.
I mean, the immediate concern is that the economic incentives, disincentives in place are basically encouraging developers and construction companies here to tear down any old building and to build, in a very short time, a fairly, often not very well constructed, much higher rise building in its place.
There are guidelines in place aimed at protecting historical buildings.
If the age of the building is over 100 years, automatically this is a national heritage building. Then the Ministry of Culture must recognize this building as a national heritage building.
There are more than 180 buildings on the heritage list, but the list has no legal binding, and government recognition of a structure's historic significance does not guarantee its survival. The Yangon Heritage Trust is leading the preservation campaign, and I'm meeting one of its founders, Momo Lwin.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
What are we looking at here?
This is former railway headquarters, and now it's under the conservation project. Okay, why don't we go and see?
Yes, I'd love to.
All right.
The Yangon Heritage Trust is recently formed. It has been organized by those who are interested in the heritage of the city So whatever we can save, we're going to save.
But the process of saving them is confusing and fraught with difficulties. The former Secretariat is one of the most spectacular colonial-era structures in Yangon. It took almost 15 years to build, and upon completion in 1905, the entire colony was run from this building. It was here that the government of the newly independent Burma first met in 1948, just a year after one of the most tragic events in the country's history: the assassination of founding father General Aung San and 6 of his colleagues. The Secretariat is a really good example of the challenges that are faced by these heritage buildings in Yangon. There is a public-private partnership that's developing the building right now, but we're not allowed access to go inside and see what's going on. And people I've spoken to, people who are actually in charge of Yangon's heritage buildings, don't even know themselves. Initial plans to turn it into a hotel sparked a public outcry, so the private developer scrapped that plan.
The private company has to turn it into a museum. With that promise, they have a chance to get the building.
But now the media is reporting that it will be turned into a combination of museum and tourist shopping center, and possibly more shopping center than museum. Coming up, I meet the historian dedicated to saving old Yangon.
I mean, it is a reminder of the colonial past. I mean, a lot of the buildings were built in colonial times, but it's also a reminder of the history of this country.
And we follow the team charged with the daunting task of deciding which buildings should be saved. Yangon is changing. In the few months since my last visit, I've noticed new shops, buildings, billboards, and far more cars. As the city modernizes, it must grapple with modern urban problems such as traffic and overcrowding. It's a compact city. Diverse neighborhoods, office blocks, and old buildings are crammed into a small downtown space, leading to the waterfront of the Yangon River.
Districts in downtown Yangon like this one contribute to its unique character. There are Indian and Chinese communities, markets, hawkers, booksellers, you name it. But people here live in constant fear that they'll be evicted to make way for commercial developments, and that the city's unique, if chaotic, charm will vanish. Thant Minh U is the grandson of former UN Secretary General U Thant and the author of 2 acclaimed books about Burmese history. He is battling to save Yangon's architectural treasures.
Some would say that they are reminders of a colonial era that was a repressive one. But is it just nostalgia, do you think?
I suppose for some people it could be that. And I think it's fair to say, I mean, it is a reminder of the colonial past. I mean, a lot of the buildings were built in colonial times, but it's also a reminder of the history of this country. I mean, it's not just bad things that happened then. The democratic tradition of this country was born then. The nationalist movement was born then. A lot of cultural development happened in the late 19th and early 20th century. I mean, this landscape, sort of downtown Yangon, Rangoon as it was then, is really the landscape on which the Burmese people first connected with the outside world, learned to be modern, where modern Burmese music, art, writing developed. It's where some of the greatest Burmese politicians, writers, artists lived and worked. And so to dismiss it as simply sort of a colonial thing, I think is a completely ahistorical view of the importance of this area.
What are some of the challenges that you face?
There are challenges. I mean, there are technical challenges.
Yeah.
A lot of these buildings are in a state of disrepair, a decay. It'll take money and time to renovate them and to make them suitable for reuse. So we've been talking a lot with the Yangon government to look at ways in which we can create a statutory list of protected buildings.
The first step is to assess and classify the buildings. Teams from the Heritage Trust have begun surveying the downtown area, trying to decide which buildings should be preserved and the challenges that will entail. It's a time-consuming task. The team must photograph and collate information on each of the buildings before compiling a report recommending them for the list. And with each passing week, investors, developers, and businesses keen to take advantage of Myanmar's entree into the modern world are snapping up buildings for office space factories, shopping malls, and hotels.
There are legal challenges. Ownership is very, very complicated in different parts of the city. And then there are, the overall sort of policy and economic challenges. I mean, who's going to pay for it? How are these things going to be financed? And there are many different options, but they all have different pros and cons.
The legal issue is proving divisive.
The Myanmar Lawyers Network, they started their protest.
Marching from here, yes.
Yeah.
From this place.
Yes.
We start marching.
Yes.
We go straight.
I see.
Ukoni leads a group of lawyers who have staged unprecedented street protests after it was announced the former High Court building, which was on the heritage list, has been leased to a business consortium that plans to turn it into a hotel. The lawyers say this is illegal, but the consortium says the government approved the long-term leasing arrangement.
We need to explain our next generation by generation. So for this purpose, we should maintain, we should control, we should protect these buildings.
Like the High Court, the Yangon Central Railway Station, also on the list, is now under a cloud. Rebuilt in the 1950s after being destroyed during World War II, it went from a colonial building to a distinctly Burmese structure, lauded for its use of indigenous tiered roofs known as piata. Despite being designated a landmark building in 1996, the city government has since announced a plan to relocate it to a satellite town 30 kilometers away. Than says that for preservation efforts to work, they need to be incorporated into a broader city planning blueprint.
If there was a very good urban planning process underway, our role would be to push for a conservation strategy as part of that process.
Yeah.
But like many things here, I mean, these things are only getting off the ground now.
Yeah.
So at the same time, we've had to help and push for this wider urban planning process. It's no good having a conservation strategy if there's no good public housing, there's no good public transport.
Yeah.
I mean, our vision is not a Yangon where everything is gentrified and it's a city that's good for only tourists and rich people, but a city that works, where there are very modern parts to the city. Maybe the majority of the city would be very modern in terms of shopping malls and new condominiums and everything else, but where at least 10% is conserved.
He cites the Bojog Angsan Market, known as Scott's Market in colonial times, as a building that's become extremely popular among tourists and locals because of its historical architecture and cobblestone inner streets, as well as its handicrafts, jewelry, and antique shops.
I think that's what makes a city a great city. You can walk around for a few miles and you see many different things and many different cultures. And I think we can have that in Yangon if there's a foresight to act very quickly.
Coming up, a magnificent hotel restored to its former glory. Sometimes private developers do get it right. meet the award-winning architect who worries that some preservation efforts may rob Yangon of its unique character.
I don't see why Yangon should be a city that needs to be frozen in time.
Construction sites like this are popping up all over Yangon, but the regulatory framework is far behind the pace of development and falls short of the city being properly managed.
The Strand Hotel is an example of how private ownership can actually benefit old buildings. Completed in the early 20th century, by 1913, the Strand had become so popular among visitors to the colony, the owners had to build an extension. But it fell into disrepair after the war, before being sold to a luxury hotel chain in 1990. Rather than destroy it, the developers restored it to its former glory, and its colonial past is a strong selling point. Emily Chai is an American architect who moved to Yangon in 2004 with her Burmese husband. Their company, Spine Architects, is one of the largest and most innovative architecture and interior design firms in the city.
Hi, Emily.
Hi, I'm Anasia. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, would love to. Thanks.
Emily has helped restore old buildings, but most of her firm's work is contemporary.
Oh, are these some of your projects?
Yes.
She's concerned that some preservation efforts, while well-meaning, may rob Yangon of its unique charm.
What I love about Yangon now, I think it has been a very organic city, at least in sort of the period of its rather isolated state. You know, these older buildings have a kind of organic life. I guess I'm talking about something like Loganat.
The stately Loganat Gallery building was once one of the city's most prestigious business addresses. It was built by a Baghdadi Jewish trader with a passion for architecture. The Loganat housed several businesses, but it was famous for its purveyors of fine liqueurs, Egyptian cigarettes, and its eccentric tenants, including a Filipino hairdresser and a Greek leather merchant. In 1971, this gallery opened on the first floor, one of the few early venues for showcasing contemporary art in Myanmar. The Loganat was also the subject of an award-winning photo essay by Ms. Chai.
It was just incredibly appealing because in every corner of the building, there was something else going on, a shop or a restaurant, there's an art gallery, and then most surprisingly finding all these families that were living on the upper floors. So I guess it was a microcosm, I suppose.
Would you say that it was representative of many buildings in downtown Yangon?
I don't think it's particularly representative because, at least at that scale, there are many smaller scale buildings that do have a mixed use. Shop houses, for instance, in Chinatown, which would have on the ground floor retail or shops and then the families living upstairs, but they're much, much smaller. Loganat really is like a little world inside. And also, there's interesting juxtaposition between old and new. It doesn't bother me personally. I think I like to see that mix. I've always felt that you can't freeze a neighborhood or a city in time. And I don't see why Yangon should be a city that needs to be frozen in time. I see a great mix still, socioeconomic class in these areas, whereas in many other cities, the kind of heritage buildings become for the elite or only for tourists. And I would not like to see that happen here.
Confusion over protection laws, debate among developers and preservationists, opposing views on how to save the colonial buildings, widespread press coverage, criticism of the government, legal threats, even street protests. The heritage issue may be divisive, but the mere fact that people are talking about this openly is a sign that Myanmar is opening up. Pre-reforms, people were arrested for protesting or speaking out, and the state-controlled media would have ignored the issue. So much is changing so quickly, including the cityscape of Yangon.
What I see happening is the buildings being taken down in downtown are often ones that have been branded as dangerous buildings.
Okay.
And then in that case, the movement to demolish and rebuild has been faster. But I'm hopeful that the government's intentions to put guidelines will move at the same time and not allow for too much to happen before those rules and regulations are in place.
I think the real challenge, the emotional challenge in a way, is at a time when people are trying to make up for lost time and trying urgently to develop, to bring in investment, to change everything, to remind people, like with the environment, that we have a lot of nice things here and we have a very beautiful city that we also have to try to protect in some way before it's too late.
Conserving Yangon's architectural heritage is a complex challenge, and it's clear that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. But all parties need guidelines for redevelopment, or this precious part of the past could be lost forever in the current wave of modernization that is sweeping the new Myanmar.